Hi, I'm Bill Arning, and so thank you for coming out today. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the background of how this show happened. Was that my husband Mark McCrae and I got to meet Sunil Gupta and Charan Singh when they were here for a show at Photo Fest that they organized a year ago, and we became friendly, and we actually bought a photograph by each one of them for our own personal collection. And when Stephen told us that they were going to be curating and doing the next Photo Fest, but that because they were curating, they were not going to be putting their own work in, and would we consider bringing this collaborative body of work to tie in with Photo Fest? I was like, well, that's just genius, and we would be thrilled to do it. And I asked Patricia Restrepo to take the hardest part of the job and making sure that the installation here looked as beautiful as possible. So she did most of the direct work with the artist. So this is just one of those marvelous collaborations. We love working with Photo Fest. We love the fact that there is the amount of attention this brings. And I got to see an earlier presentation of these collaborative photographic projects in New York. And each individual photograph is an amazing sort of story within a story. But I have to say, Patricia did, with the artist, a wonderful job of making the spatial experience and the narrative of this gorgeous and irresistible, and really calls you into the stories of these characters. So at this point, I'm going to introduce Patricia and the artist, and come up and we can talk a little discussion of the individual stories, or however you want to take this.
Great. Do you two want to join me up at the front?
Hello?
Yeah. Yes. Come on.
Please do. So something that Bill emphasized over and over again in that introduction was the collaborative nature of this body of work. And something that I want to point out to the audience is that this body of work actually constitutes your first formal collaboration. And you two both have individual artistic and academic practices that precede this collaboration. So before we start talking about this body of work, could you briefly discuss your individual focuses and what perspective you brought to this collaboration?
Oh, I think I must say that our first formal collaboration was our marriage. I think when we approached by the foundation which commissioned this work, we were contemplating that they might consider our previous body of work, which is portraitures from both of us, but then when it became about the law and conversation, so we thought that we would like to do a new body of work and tell our version of the stories, and in this kind of like very everydayness and create this kind of like everydayness experience of these lives. But before that, I think I would like to go back about the foundation of this project, and why it was important is that because of the law, and this conversation started right after the second judgment by Supreme Court in Delhi, which was the recriminalization of homosexuality in India. And I think if we think about that law, it also brings the idea of when the law was being formed, and the few years before that, what happened in the world actually. So it is the 1857 where the India mutiny happened, and that sort of like, if you see the world's history, you can define almost the pre and past, because that describe the nature of the empire in the UK and all the other colonies. And then right after that, there were two laws was being made. One is the 1860 society law, and the 1816 again the anti-sodomy law, which was still relevant because it's illegal. And I think what happened with I think that's the kind of like a start, because it was important time when the law was being sort of like it kind of reversed the judgment, and then we were talking about this idea that how we are going to respond to that law. And the nature of our collaboration was that we would bring these two different we know several people amongst our friends, and then And Sunil was thinking that we could bring all the elements together and now when I came to this particular space, I thought this is like our drawing room and we are bringing all the different people in our room because this wall kind of reminds me of that. You want to say something more, Sunil?
Oh, well, I came to it from a slightly very different trajectory, I suppose. I migrated to Canada as a teenager in 1969, which is very fortuitous. It was the year of Stonewall, but at the point of migration, I had already been involved in quite a lot of sexual activity, and I thought, but this was amongst my peers in India. So arriving in Canada, I first didn't think that white people did this kind of thing because nobody had mentioned it. So in all the literature about Canadian immigration, they'd never said there were something called homosexuals in Canada. So I just thought they were all straight. And so it took me a year to figure out there was.
This was Montreal?
This was Montreal. And then having figured it out then, almost immediately there was gay liberation right in my university. So I became very much part of it. So I was just in time for 1970, 72, marching on the street, but it came out of a rights movement. So our earliest gay rights marches were embedded in workers' rights marches and were coincidental to, the day was actually May the 1st, it was the May Day rallies and so on. And then we were students, it was anti-war, it was very politicized basically. And the understanding of gay was political rather than lifestyle at that point. So then I spent a year in New York, which was in 76, where there was a lot of public gay activity. So I lived in Chelsea, and so everywhere you looked, there seemed to be thousands of gay men, always out and always on the
cruising.
Polite way of saying cruising.
Cruising, yeah.
And so then I didn't get back to India till the 80s and with a camera, and I thought, I didn't go there to shoot gay material, but I thought since I was there, I should maybe think about it. Because there'd been this big disconnect between my experiences and my later understandings and an experience of India. And what I found was that nobody wanted to talk about it, nobody mentioned it, it was not in the media, it was not to be heard of. And even people who were practicing it didn't really want to say anything. But the word gay was kind of very gradually seeping in here and there. There would be some people I'd meet and they'd say, oh, I'm gay. But then I would argue with them and say, well, you don't feel very gay because A, you're married, you're just doing this on your way home from work sometimes. That doesn't sound very gay to me. That's not very political. That's just having your cake and eating it. Maybe. So that was, so there was a kind of so then I had to leave it for a while. And nobody, of course, wanted to be in the pictures. So we fast forward to the 2000s, and I went back, now in my 50s, to kind of having a long history by then in the UK. And then back in India, suddenly, and I went back because curator friend of mine said, let's show your work. It had never been shown there because of the same silence around the issue. And so in 2004, we made an exhibition of 4 bodies of work of mine, one of which was from the 80s about gay men in Delhi, so it located it back there. One of which was about my being HIV positive, which is something else that they really don't want to hear about very much. So it was kind of very radical in that sense and new. So, but many things happened. The gallery agreed to show it. They only took out one picture in which my genitals were visible, and which I thought was actually pretty innocuous. Anyway, they didn't want it to. And then all these people came, and it got quite a lot of publicity, I think, partly because of the nature of it. And then also, I was there in person, so I think many people just came to see what I looked like, because there weren't many. I thought people came to the exhibition and was staring at me, not the work, because I was like this gay HIV person who was out in that local setting. Anyway, then I moved there.
Why did you move there?
Oh, because some guy chased me, actually. I'm not a very...
No, not for political reasons. You weren't going to be an activist.
No, that's because, so also I'd avoided Indian men sexually for a long time, because having discovered lovely Canadian men and how you can do it, you know, in the privacy of your bedroom with hours to spare and red wine and all of that. Big difference from behind the bushes in Delhi. You know, so this Indian pressure to kind of, with no place and the hurried and the semi-public way it happened, didn't really appeal to me, so I just generally stayed away from it. But anyway, I was pursued and seduced by somebody in 2004, and I fell for it. And so I moved myself there. And by the time I moved myself there, the person had lost interest. But having arrived, I thought I can't just do a U-turn and go back to England. I've now got to make something out of this. And luckily for me, two things happened. One is that the whole gay question had arrived in the media. Yes. So it was like out big time. There was articles endlessly about it in the English language press.
Yeah, because of the murder.
There was a famous murder that took place that provoked a big discussion. And the media's response to gay men went from very hostile initially and then slowly became more positive as the rights argument developed. And then I used my 70s gay liberation inclination to join radical young activists in Delhi who were celebrating their 20th birthday, you know, literally themselves. So they were all university kids, actually.
Yeah. Upper class generally, or?
English speaking, kind of elite, but quite literate and quite well versed in the globalized debate around gay, and it was all heading towards queer theory politics, actually. And then this whole discussion about the law did happen in English, in the media. The law is framed in English. And when the law changed in English, so one of the things that the group decided to do was to connect with non-English speaking groups and explain to them that the law had changed, because they didn't really, we thought they didn't know what had happened.
Yeah, but also I think it was surprising for many of the people at that time that they thought that we didn't knew that we were doing all the cops and the lawyers and everything, and we didn't knew that it was illegal. And why governments bother? Because I think in one of the, if you see the book interviews, somebody is saying that I didn't knew that this is like my property and government is bothered about that. Things like that people are saying. But also I want to respond to what you said earlier, that people came to see you as HIV positive, because till then HIV was also considered as a very like a poor people's issue. So the whole HIV programming and the whole enterprise was kind of like focused on the underclasses, and then they created these identities such as like high risk populations and MSM and FSWs. I mean, female sex workers or commercial sex workers or ID users. So it was a very much like a class issue or economy issue. And that is the kind of like question I am dealing with now, and then in this work also we are trying to sort of like move away from that sort of like victimized HIV narratives from the underclass people. And you see that they are talking about their loves, they're talking about their family anxieties, they're talking about like like religion and what it does to form the identities. I think in Rizwan's case where he was the religion was very important because they were living in the village, and the education never happened because of this kind of like taboo and being feminine. So I think when you are so close, so I think what happens with this class issue, because you can be feminine and very well known fashion designer, but you can't be a poor person, because in today's time, 2 days ago there was a case in Pune in Maharashtra where trans women was denied entry in a shopping mall. So forget about the museums and other kind of places where public places such as mall and shopping places are not very welcome for all the other class of like this diversity.
One thing you had talked about was that even though this is a collaborative project, you're taking individual photographs, and the English speakers, the people from the academic world, are more people in Sunil's world, and your world is more the folks who are on the street, and how that you can walk through going, okay, if this is their life, this is probably one of your friends. If this is their life, this is probably one of your friends. Can you talk a little bit about how that inflects the idea of the collaboration?
Actually, most of these people we know amongst ourselves, both of them. Because before this project, we tried to live together in Delhi, and so it was over the 4 or 5 years. I got to know almost everybody in the pictures, and I'm friends with them. And I think we took only few people. We didn't manage to overlap, but almost everybody we took pictures of each other. So I took pictures of Chappal, for instance, or like Anita there, and all the girls that side.
At the point at which we started, though, I'd already started making a different project, which was just portraits of single people in the street, amongst the more bourgeois type people that I knew. And that was unusual for them because, of course, Delhi's a bit like Houston. The middle class, you're in a car. So the better off people are never to be seen unless you go to a nightclub or a restaurant. You only see them in malls. You don't see them. Yeah. So these two worlds never meet because they're never in the same physical space. A bit like here, so you probably get that. There's a separateness to it. So. And then I began to think I had to justify why my project of 50 portraits was all this class of people and not all the rest of the people who were on the streets. So I grabbed hold of him and said,
and then I said to that, why I'm not in your Mr. Malhotra's party, and if I wanted to go in those places.
So you gave me some people, so then we had like half a dozen of the street queens,
the street
which
queens,
I took pictures of for my other project. So actually, see, both of us did think that we didn't want to go touring in the other class, because there's a lot of that happens. Because the background to this is that visually and photographically and through the media in South Asia and India, there's a classic image of the hijra, cross-dressing, street queen, acting out for the camera. You know, the cameras love them, they love the cameras, and they'll do a kind of pseudo Bollywood dance for you. You know, so they're featured all over the world in German magazines and American magazines. People just, you know, just colorful and exotic and everything. So we really didn't want to go that route because they are colorful, exotic, and everything. And so we wanted to go for a kind of more knowing intimacy, you know, where, another level of comfort.
We might want to step back and just also talk about how hijra exists in culture, how it's a legally recognized third gender, it's overlaps with trans, but it's not the same as. Can you give a little background on who the hijra are and when you photograph them?
Well, they have a deep historical presence in Indian society, and until up to the Mughal Empire, they even had a role in court, so where they were elevated almost to the level of prime minister or something, in the sense that they became trusted advisors. And the reason we know this is through historical records. A friend of ours, Mario, is doing a history PhD at Rutgers, and he's looking at one particular region at it's the financial records of one of the local kingdoms, and it's full of receipts to maintain these hijras at the level of luxury they were used to. So it's for their food and their servants and their carriage rides and all of that. So we know that they had a kind of position, but it's since the 18th century, since the British East India Company came and took over slowly, and then eventually by the mid-19th, the British turned India into an actual colony. This group of people kind of completely lose their status and are reduced to almost like
begging and
begging
performing,
and doing
Because-
sex work and that kind of thing.
Because I think that was first what happened with Mario's research suggests that before that there was not sort of like there weren't that much paperwork. Like I have given the land to this, but there were bills, but they weren't that kind of like that document which suggests that this land is given to this person or this tax is going to this person, because they were also tax collectors. But what happened when the British came and they dismissed that law because it's not legal, it's not written anywhere that land belongs to this person, then they contest the law, they contest that, and the court cases, so he's tracing the court cases and where these people are, how much powerful these people were, these Hijras were, and he's tracing those case stories, because the British also brought the documentation, which is great in a way. So that kind of thing. So he's but on the other hand, there is a whole history of in mythologies, in all the kind of like religions, in Islam and in Hinduism and in many other kind.
And they also they would come to you at important occasions like a marriage, definitely at a birth. So if there was any doubt in your baby's sexuality, intersex or something, they would take the baby away and bring it up.
Because it seems to that they are gods, because they are not male, not female, therefore they have power to bless and curse.
Yeah. And I think one crucial thing to remember is that unlike the West, Hijras as a community in India were always very publicly visible.
Yeah.
So many people we spoke to have told us that when they were little, and even if they were living in a slum and unable to access the internet or to information and all of that, they just saw them.
Yeah, so there is
so they could identify, there was something to identify with on the street, that there was a kind of third gender on the loose in their society, very visibly.
Yeah, even I think Geeta, the other character, she writes about that how as a lesbian she couldn't find another companion, but then there was this visible culture of queerness, and then there's a kind of relationship with that, and then a lot of people identify that.
Because on the other hand, if you're lesbian or gay, there's nothing visible. So a lot of people think, gee, I'm the only one, because there's no other visible people around them.
And India actually has the most populous third gender in the world. They're between 5 and 6 million. And India is one of the only countries that legally recognizes, I think it was 2014, right? That they were legally recognized as a separate third gender on all documents.
Yes.
It's coming to government documents.
Yes.
And while we're stepping back and laying some foundational work upon which this body of work was built, could you briefly explain that you two met in 2009, which was also a foundational year for the legal battles that were transpiring in India. And Sunil, could you talk about the connection between those battles and colonialism?
Yes. I'll just also mention that we met at an AIDS conference. So AIDS has been very much featured in our lives, so to speak. And that's how two different kinds of people also came together at times like that. But this whole rights discussion that came up, the law itself came from an 1860 not a judgment, a kind of implementation to both name homosexuality as a kind of practice, because it didn't really have a name as such before that. And then to promptly make it illegal throughout England and its colonies. So, and the wording of this law, which talks about unnatural acts, occurs in all of the colonies, from Singapore to Malaysia to Uganda and so on. And by the way, it applies to everyone. It's not legalistically anti-gay. It's just anti everything that's not any kind of sex that's not leading to childbirth. So no oral sex, no anal sex, even for heterosexual married couples. It's just that the practice of going after people has historically tended to be vulnerable gay people, as I would have said, but of course that's not what he might say, but because they're not gay in that same sense.
Yeah.
But so obviously the most vulnerable are either the very visible ones on the street, these street queens who are doing sex work, who would get bashed up, roughed up and all of that, or sexually abused or raped, to the better off ones who sometimes get caught up in blackmail. So there's a lot of that goes on.
But I think the interesting thing was this law was, India was the pilot project for this law originally, and then it was reintroduced to the Queen Victoria at that time, and then she said, okay, yeah, this works very well, because it was used as a pilot base in India, and then it was implemented all across the world.
And the Queen didn't think there were lesbians were possible, so it never included them.
She took lesbians out of the law because women don't do that kind of thing.
But then a few years ago, because we had all of this legal exchange in India, our neighbor in Sri Lanka suddenly woke up to the fact that they have the same law, but lesbians aren't included. They thought, oh, let's add them. So Sri Lanka's added them in.
So this law was enacted in India for 150 years and then overturned in 2009, which was also the year you two met.
Overturned in
the Delhi High Court.
Yes. And
then for the following 4 years, this law, people felt empowered to come out. They were more visible, but simultaneously more vulnerable. And then is it in 2013 that the law was reversed in the Supreme Court, correct?
Yes.
And then your photographs were taken in the 2 years following the second reversal.
No, we actually started talking because it was in December 2013, and we started speaking sort of like a May about this project, and we took pictures in the same year, next year, following within first year this project was on the road, and people were so that's why we also approached so many people, and we would try to figure out who we can include, and people can understand the consent and all that implication, that because this is going to be a big project, it's going to be mass produced possibly, then so that was the kind of like challenge, because we have to like work through so many people, how to bring diversity because so that's why we spoke that I want to include somehow these lives also. Lily's and Rizwan and Kishan and Jatin and also other kind of which we don't see normally, like Anita and Geeta on the other side, because they are not in that kind of like everyday activism, but they are very different. So we wanted to bring those lives also, so that have a sort of like a not holistic, but like at least as diverse as possible picture of queer people in India.
Yeah, I want to clarify that when you mentioned the names of Geeta, and the whole project is framed around individual narratives.
Yes.
And in the big book of the work, including, and then what we're doing today, it's tracing different life stories of people.
Even the catalog also sort of like talks about that in this kind of each quote. So it kind of gives that what the kind of concern they have. We try to highlight that in the essay also in conversation.
And you sort of get to know them as people, particularly if you have both books, you'll get to know their stories and care about them, because they're presented not as types, but as like just because when you see Hijra in culture, they're so grand, you don't actually think of them as having biographies or parents or kids or the other things they have in your much more fully fleshed out narratives.
Yes.
Because I think the idea of it's very radical in India to like to not get married. So I'm just looking at the person over there behind. So he's an older man now. He's a couple of years older than me, and he's single, and he's not unhappy about it, because almost everybody's parents reacted to their coming out children by saying, you're going to be alone. Who's going to look after you? Indians don't understand, there's no concept of you age gracefully alone. Yeah. There has to be this familial...
Well, and there is an economic impact to not being married and having children.
Yeah.
It affects inheritance rights, your ability to get your family money, which I did not know about till reading the narratives in your work.
So, but there is this current younger generation that's now willing to acknowledge that. And there is a growing sense of this alternative queer family that's not necessarily your biological family.
But also people are questioning the structure of the family, and why, like in Rahul's story, he sort of talks about that, why we always have to think about the family and the blood and all that relations, and why can't we think about family as a different, like alternative families, and why can't we sort of embrace that other kind of like kinships?
So storytelling is clearly integral to this work, there's a 23-minute documentary that accompanies this photographic work, and then of course there's the textual component alongside the visual. And can you two speak to the importance that you place on agency? I know that when you were here for your site visit, it was so essential for you to have the audience see and hear these individuals, 20 of them, in their voices, not you two serving as mediators, but serving as a platform to elevate their voices.
Yeah, that's something that's come up through this particular project, actually, and it's, I think, well, we think it's quite successful because, no? I mean,
Yes.
this much, no, because...
The problem was, I think what the problem for me was, is that a lot, when we were talking to these people, to all the people in the project, few of them have spoken in different languages, like Hindi, for instance. And when
no, but I meant actually on the wall, because this was something we've just done here.
Yes. Yeah.
Because this was also a kind of collaboration with Patricia.
Yes.
Because in this previous iteration in New York, we only had the pictures.
Images.
There was none of the quotes on the wall. So you just saw the pictures, then you had the big book on the side. But here it's kind of, as an exhibition, it's come up.
Yes, yeah, that's true, yeah. Because it's a kind of like it's a kind of a book on the wall in a way, in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
And something that you told me when you were here was that you didn't want these quotes to just be read as captions,
Yes.
that they really were meant to hold the same weight as the visual component of your work.
Yeah.
And I remember you telling me that, or one of you, that so many times these individuals had been seemingly exploited by well-meaning organizations who had come in, recorded their stories, and then those individuals never heard back from these nonprofit organizations and were kind of thrown by the wayside, whereas you have maintained long-standing connections with all of these individuals and really are taking their agency as a central point of your work.
Yes.
I think so, because you've had a very long-term relationship with somebody, the person over there.
Yeah. Even Lily, I know, when we met in '98, we were both
This is Lily here.
cute and young. She's very cute even now. So, I mean, basically what happens with the project, I approached the people who I knew before for quite a long time, and then they trust me because it was right after the law also. So we have to create this sort of like this relationship that we are not going to, we have to justify with these conversations. And also, for me it was a very personal, a lot of burden that how to translate, because people were speaking in Hindi, and how to translate exactly, because a lot of people also speak in a very different dialect which only Hijra community speaks. They call it Farsi, but it's not Persian exactly. So they have a very different lingo to explain and to talk, and a lot of people talks in a kind of like very Bollywoodized, like very different kind of like a different lingos. So we have to like make sure that how we don't want to put our meanings in this story. We want to like exactly how they might have thought and they might have like worked. So we have to like constantly check with them that this is what I'm going to write, and this is what it means and how it means, all those kind of like details of the text in the story. So that was kind of very crucial for us to like keep their voice as it is, and we don't want to put any kind of meaning and editing and any kind of that sort of like an authority of their voices.
I mean, I guess there's one or two kinds of people who are not here, so it's not like this is like a complete overview of.
Yes. Yeah.
So there's no lesbians from the slums, let's say, because we thought they'd be too vulnerable to exposure.
Because if you imagine the class of Jatin and Kishan in that class, and they themselves are very exposed, and being as a man, you still have certain privilege in the society, but what would be for equivalent queer women in that classes? So they are much more vulnerable. So we have to maintain that dignity, and also that a lot of people actually some of the people approached us in that conversation, then we have to we spoke to other friends, other women in the other wall, Deepthi and Pony and Rituparna, that what do we do and how do we do it. But we can't also speak for everybody in that. So we have to also, because this kind of project, we have to create as much as we can, and also don't put people in danger, because we were also not sure that what's going to happen with the law, because we were also very new, and suddenly it's changed and it's Supreme Court, there's no other court. So how that's going to implicate everybody's life
and also we haven't got the Girias, who are the kind of hyper-masculine husband figures.
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, I see a little parallel with early 20th century England, where working class queers had the option of being either very feminine, like the naked civil servant, or being very masculine. There was no in-between. The in-between, I'm normal but gay, seems to have been a middle class, upper class kind of option.
Well, speaking of how quickly this situation is shifting, as of the week of the installation here at CAM, the courts actually announced that they were going to review their reversal. Is that correct? And
yes,
they're
going to look at the judgment again.
Yes.
And you said that the courts were really wary of reversing other courts, and that the understanding the deep politics. So that is one question. You know, you've been as curator of PhotoFest, you've been presenting visions of India to a Texas audience and the PhotoFest audience, most of whom I would assume have not been there. One thing when we were looking at the selection for this show, was there's so little that smacks of exoticization, or of, like, apart from the one of the monkey eating Cheetos around the corner, there's no sort of thing that this couldn't be in an Indian community in New Jersey. How do you feel? Do you feel the weight of presenting a culture, both in your work here and in your curatorial work, to an audience that might have never, they might have seen an Indian movie or read a couple Indian novels? Or how do you feel the weight of representation on this?
Oh, it's enormous. There's this famous book by John Tagg, The Burden of Representation. Yeah. And I have a background in something called Black Arts in England, where you were fighting for access and fighting for self-representation in the art world, and then equally ending up with the kind of the burden of it, and trying to ensure that it's as truthful as possible and as democratic as possible, and so on. So that's why in the larger PhotoFest exhibition and that curatorial exercise, it became very essential to me at the very outset to explain to Fred and Wendy and Stephen that I could only do it if they would allow me to conceptualize it as people of Indian origin who might imagine India, not India, the place imagined by everybody else including, you know, the likes of Margaret Bourke-White and Cartier-Bresson and so on, and their current sort of, so it's tricky because I really like the monkey, because one of the things I like about India is that it's, I just personally like living creatures, and we are surrounded by them there. And monkeys are one of those things. So when you drive down the streets of Delhi, sooner or later you see an elephant blocking the road. And there's a big traffic jam with an elephant at the other end of it. So because that still happens. So in that sense, yeah, it's kind of nostalgia as well for me.
But yeah, it is also very hard to also not show this sort of like, we don't want to like replicate what people have done it over the years of this kind of like poverty porn, and also like exotification of people, and therefore we also brought various different kind of people which you normally see in the queer context, like all the other in this kind of like a very domestic environment. People don't see somebody 68 who's lying on this bed. You don't see this kind of images very often. How people are, like.
Well, I would suggest that in North American gay culture, we also don't see representation of people over 30 much.
Exactly.
So it's there's that issue of older gay invisibility. That,
or women of that age.
Yeah.
Also, we didn't want to exoticize either the extreme wealth that some of these people have access to, or the extreme poverty that some of these people live with. I mean, some of the people on these walls live in slums. They live in one room, and they bathe outside.
Yeah.
So because that's the other nature of India, is that we see it in its. That's the history of photography is like that. I mean, it always seems to be depicting these places either in this fabulous kind of.
It's like Slumdog Millionaire or
the treasures of India, or
exotic
the extreme
hotel.
poverty and the kind of the nearly dead and the starving kind of India.
Speaking of issues of representation, when you were here in Houston for your site visit, Sunil, you told me that when you were studying art history, you looked for images of people of Indian descent and origin or queer lives of color, but you didn't see those documented in photographic history, and that you made it one of your goals to try to insert and ensure that those lives are upheld and valued within the art historical canon. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so I went to formal art school in England between the late 70s and the early 80s at the Royal College of Art, and I didn't encounter anything very much, beyond Europe, and certainly nothing gay, even from this part of the world. I think people whispered about, there was a Robert Mapplethorpe exhibition, but it couldn't be brought into England. It was too pornographic or something. And then somebody sneaked it in through the diplomatic bag and put it up at the ICA. It was like that kind of thing behind black curtains. It was all hush-hush and not to be talked about. So anyway, so I came out in this post-colonial, post-modern moment, and I had no references, so that was a bit tragic, because then I didn't know what to make work about. And my tutor would say, you're a gay man, maybe you should do fashion, or fashion photography or something. And they sent me off to fashion photography studios. Anyway, so I decided I would make it my kind of personal ambition to get this discussion going. So I've been making a series of bodies of work around this gay issue, and I still do. So I think some people find me a little bit, they ask me, when am I going to grow out of it? It's like a teenage thing that you kind of want to grow out of. It's like still going to discos or something, at your age, Where are the larger questions? I think all the larger questions for me are in here, in this kind of material. So it's an endless quest for something now. But I'm very happy to say that it has become part of kind of cultural discussion and debate, and younger people who write to me from their universities saying that they now find these pictures, and so they have something to kind of go with and react to and so on. And I guess in the last 12 months there have been 2 acquisitions from this kind of thing, which so the MoMA bought the very early Indian gay pictures from Exiles, and the Tate is just about to acquire a bunch of things. So I guess I can retire now.
How much time do we have? Should we shift to the second room quickly? I know there were some works that we wanted to speak to and a closer study. Charan, I know that one of your focuses in your current PhD is the intersection of language with these issues that we've been discussing, and I know that you wanted to speak specifically to Krishan's story as it shows the insertion of this terminology from outside sources of...
When I first learned about, like, there is other world other than my family, immediate family, who are also practicing homosexuality, and suddenly I found myself in sort of like a park and cruising spaces, and it was the same time when we started working with the HIV programming and started developing these self-help groups. And with HIV at the time, to me, it was not like my prime concern, because the information at that time that it was that you die with HIV like in 5 years or 10 years. If you live happily, you would die in 10 years. And what for people like me and Jatin and Lily, the concern was how to live everydayness of the life, the criticality of the life, how to step out of the house, how to do these things, how to go back to school, or how to like at least or have education, because people were deprived. And also what NGO showed us, this dream to you can live happily, you have the safe space and the kind of like and then in the West we call these things MSM, and suddenly people thought blindly, people thought like, okay, oh wow, there's a term now, this MSM, and MSM stands for men who are having sex with men, and it was generated by UN organizations and introduced to all the developing countries. And in now recent years, MSMs, people are writing. So in 2005, there's an article, very interesting article by two women who talking about the MSM and origin, and how the MSM was only implied to people of color, poor people in developing countries. So it was also this kind of other narratives also. And what here he says, like Jatin, so it's also irony, Kishan, he says also irony that when I came to NGO, I figured out that I am gay. Because in now current debates, the MSM is sort of like dying down because it's been consumed for 20 years. So now people are using term because everybody is LGBT plus. So people are sort of like thinking what is the equivalent of Kothi, or what is the equivalent of or like fag, you know. Yeah. So what is the equivalent of these words? So they think that gay is the equivalent of fag or Kothi or other kind of like terminology which have been used and adopted by these people. So I think that's for me very interesting, but also in very curious for me, for my research, at how this language have been consumed and used to create this sort of like victimized narrative. And people, I mean, I used to think that I'm MSM for several years, I mean for almost like, because the because that was the only English, because people like to feel also like, because English also have seen in India as a kind of like very, sort of like a power of colonial, because you know, that kind of thing. So people wanted to speak in English, but then people who couldn't have access or education. So there is other kind of like this whole systematic oppression which comes through the education system, how education have also deliberately keeping these two worlds separately. So when I met Sunil, he introduced me to Passage to India, and I was like, oh my God, like it's this gay sort of like aesthetic or homoerotic book you can buy from the like very swanky bookstore. It's like, I thought these books can only exist under the cover on the roadside. So you know, that kind of thing. And we saw, at that time I remember we saw together that book, that movie, Single Man, and I was like, oh my God, there's like mainstream actors are doing. So the culture which was divided. I was surprised to see that there is a whole culture, whole art world, or whole, you know, like writing and visual work, which is also dividing through the language, so that those works never been reached to a lot of us. Only the thing which I knew about the book of the Philadelphia, because it was to do with HIV and AIDS. So I knew the movie of Philadelphia, you know. So and then there is a remake of that. So that's why I think I kept this quote, because it's also show the irony of it.
Yeah. Yeah. But it became a nationalist thing also, because there was a big discussion through the AIDS funders that these terms Kothi and Hijra were indigenous, and therefore better and are the ones to be used. But some of the more middle class people argued back, actually, that those are also words of oppression.
Yeah.
And the kind of identity that Kothis have, which is a feminine half of a couple, where the masculine half needs to be serviced, and you go out and you do sex work and petty thieving so that you can give this guy money and maintain him in some sort of style. In return, he beats you up. You know, it's like a battered wife syndrome. And so why would gay men want to be
No, but I think it's also to do with how those stories have been consumed and written. Who were the people who were writing those stories or oppressive scenarios of Khotis? So that was also written in English. People have no, I mean, I had no access to that art, that whole conversation. So how can I defend myself that if I've been
but this
called...
is what Ashok and people like the AIDS people were pushing.
But they are the one who also...
And what's that guy, the one who died?
No, but they are the ones, Sunil, who are also used this whole economy of Khoti to build their own empires.
So that's... They made it very,
Actually, I don't know if the term, do you want to define the term Khoti?
Khoti is this, what Sunil just said, that it's a term for feminine men who are underclass primarily, also speaking vernacular languages and didn't go to school or went to school, but primarily because these Khotis sort of like inherited the whole umbrella of MSM, and MSM inherit without knowingly this whole closet scenario. So that this whole Khoti assume that they are closeted, but they are the one who are always on the street, and they are the one who also made gave this sort of like body biopolitic to this whole contemporary argument about the numbers and the datas. So the data comes from those Khotis.
But they're not hijras, so they're not looking to be castrated and all that. So
I think we should...
they're closer to what we would just think of regular gay men, except they're into drag and dressing up and that kind of thing. And they're looking for this is a crucial thing, they're looking for a very straight acting husband.
Yes. As in the Quentin Crisp, there is no great dark man.